Cues for Leadership.
There's something I've been sitting with, especially as AI continues to accelerate. So many posts we're responding to, and we have more frameworks than ever, more structure, more methodology, and yet it seems like the execution is still breaking down out there.
I've noticed the same thing because if we look on paper, organizations are more equipped than they've ever been. So what do you think is actually missing?
There might be a couple things because there's real value in how people are structuring their businesses. There's a lot of different models that actually work. Like we've used a lot of structural change models like Cotter's model and transformations that you and I have done. We've worked with Prosy and AdCard. These frameworks really do provide something crucial, the backdrop for change.
Yes, they give us the what and the how, but when we look at it, there's so much more to a change than just the what and the how. There's the people.
Exactly.
The thing is, they want to help align leadership, creating sequencing, establish visibility. But the distinction really is when you create all that infrastructure and processes, it doesn't cause anything to be executed. So if frameworks are infrastructure, what actually allows us to drive that execution?
I think this is where I would probably think about something like an operating system that I know actually works, something like the IDEA operating system, not just as another framework, but as an operating system for execution intelligence. It's one of the most complete operating systems I've seen in a long time.
That's really interesting. Can you explain more what you mean by that IDEA operating system?
Sure. IDEA as an operating system sits inside the infrastructure where frameworks like ADCAR or Cotter define the path. IDEA operating system, at least that specific one, governs how humans actually move through the infrastructure. And at its core, it's about four continuous dynamics. And I guess the letters IDEA: interpretation, how people perceive what's happening. You and I talk about the central nervous system. That's what it's going to hit first. Decisioning, how they process and even choose or make choices when they're in an uncertain time or when there's volatility. Execution, how action occurs in real time, like what's really going on right now. Can they really see it? And then feedback loops that allow them to adapt. And how quickly they learn and adjust is critical. What we found that in our work is that those dynamics don't improve on their own. They require specific conditions to stabilize. That's where we focus through what we call vitals.
And that's a great explanation. I really appreciate it. And so often we get caught up in the structure and the processes and just making sure those are all really tied together. But what we tend to leave out and figure will just happen, it's how the people can really function inside of that. And I really appreciate that you brought in the nervous system. Because if we don't consider the way the nervous system really adapts and works in that, it changes everything.
Exactly. The real constraint isn't whether people's implementation of a plan or whether the plan exists. It's whether people can think, decide, and then adapt fast enough to keep up with it.
And I think the other thing that we have to add in now and talk about is AI, because AI just amplifies that gap because it changes the pace of what we're doing everything at.
It actually does it exponentially. It increases the speed, it increases the complexity. I think it increases the ambiguity.
Those are great points. Back again to that human nervous system, right? And we tend to overlook that, but it doesn't interpret it as acceleration. It looks at it as more uncertainty, a risk, something it's not sure it wants to move forward with. When we look at that from a biological perspective, that can be seen as a threat and put us back in that trying to thrive in this world. And that really creates that volatility. And all our central nervous system sees is it as a threat. And how is it going to survive?
And I think when leaders see hesitation, they tend to call it resistance, especially at a managerial or a director's level. The C-level suite may not see that as much because it's tempered by a lot of times the information they get from managers, middle managers specifically, or else they'll call it capability gaps. We need more people to fulfill this, or we have a gap here that we need to fulfill. I think what's actually happening is something else. The system is really trying to regulate. It's trying to figure out how to do these new things in presence of AI with the expectations and all these new dashboard expectations, et cetera. And what we see is overanalysis, delayed decisions, people second guessing themselves. It looks like a thinking problem, but I don't think it's a thinking problem. I actually think it's a state problem, like the emotional state that people are in.
And I think that's a really good point because a lot of times we look at state as being something that's abstract, but it's not. It can be measured in real time, right? And you can determine if someone has the clarity, if they have the ability to do something with that information, if there's any trust, if it really fits into what they see as adding value and that they can act and they don't have that hesitation. They don't sit there and go, does it make sense? Really don't understand it. Where does it fit? And I think this really brings us into that next topic I know that we want to talk about again. And these are signals that we can track through the vitals. So I would like to ask you, how do we really connect the vitals back to execution?
I think we do it at the human system level because everything comes back to three conditions. Is there a commitment, which is the willingness to act? Is there capacity, the ability to really understand and decide and adapt? And then the culture. Does the environment support or suppress either of those? And the way we operationalize that is through a set of conditions that we call vitals, because commitment, capacity, and culture, they don't shift through intention. They shift when the underlying signals like clarity, trust, intention, and adaptability are stabilized.
And I think that's a really great way to phrase it. Frameworks organize change, right, and allow it to happen, but they can't determine whether the change actually happens. They can just put together a framework. And this is a really big distinction that is very helpful to understand. So, what can leaders do differently that can actually change this?
I think one, they should stop treating clarity as communication and start treating it as regulation. When there's disclarity, it's not because people don't want to communicate. That's hardly ever the case in any organization. People typically are there willingly. There's a trade-off. So it's not that they don't want to communicate. It's actually that they don't understand the signals or the signals are stressing them out. So I would say it starts with regulation and really understanding how the central nervous system not only affects individuals, both in leadership, but what that does in terms of how the employees interpret those signals in their central nervous system, because that's what's going to create the culture. And clarity does something very specific. It reduces the perceived threats. I think it stabilizes people's ability to understand because the stress response does not allow prefrontal cortex to be epitomized. And what it also does is it increases decision velocity. People have clarity because they understand with no threat, they can make decisions faster and those decisions are better. And without those three things or that clarity, because of regulation, everything leads to decision volatility.
And I think that's why we treat clarity as a vital, not as a communication skill. Part of that clarity is everybody understanding, not just one person and thinking that's okay. Because if we look at words, right, a lot of times we overlook what words really mean. If you change the I to we in illness, you have wellness. So think about that from an organizational perspective. If everybody's doing it alone because there's not clarity, you're creating illness. If everybody's together as a group, you're creating wellness. Same word. Everything that we've heard from Cotter and ADKAR and ProSci and the idea operating system vitals and even AI. What's really a simple way to understand this and a good way to implement it and put it into place?
I believe that frameworks like ADKAR and Cotter provide the infrastructure, at least the backdrop to allow change to happen, perhaps. AI accelerates the environment, and so things just speed up. And if there's not a good operating system, like the way that IDEA works, that helps us understand the execution layer, how people interpret, decide, adapt in real time, none of that's going to move unless the human system is stable. And that stability is what we focus on through vitals because they determine whether execution actually happens.
Now it's becoming a lot more than just that definition that we're all accustomed to of change management. It's so much more.
It absolutely is. I mean, they still matter as frameworks, but I think we have to really look at operating systems because that helps us understand the execution layer, which is how people function inside the change. None of it translates into results unless the human system is stable.
And that's where our work comes in.
Exactly. At Cues for Leadership, we focus on those vitals because they're the conditions that determine whether execution actually happens. I mean, things like clarity, trust, intent, and adaptability, not as concepts, but as real-time signals inside of teams and or organizations. If you think about it, in an AI accelerated environment, you don't close the gap with better frameworks. Close it by stabilizing how the people function inside of those frameworks.
I agree completely. I love how that was said. And really, to make it easy for people to understand, frameworks guide change, AI accelerates it. And the idea operating system that helps reveal the gap. But vitals, That really determines whether anything can actually move.
Thanks for joining us on this edition of Behavioral Echoes. We hope that we've given some clarity to what's really happening, not just in organizations, but how the impact of change management, where the deficits and gaps are, and why it's important to look at your infrastructure as an operating system with capacity building for people as the critical element. Join us next time. Thank you to my co-host. Thank you for hanging out with us. Bye for now.
Bye.